So we're going to start. Welcome to the final sort of content panel for the symposium. We're all in very different time zones. For us in Europe, this is very civilized, but I appreciate for those in North America, in Australia, that it's early and late. So thanks to everyone for your understanding in terms of the time zone differences. But as I would see faces, but you're welcome to turn it off if you're not comfortable. One of our papers was not able to make it today. So the first panel wasn't able to make it. So Marcel unfortunately couldn't present. What that means though is that the papers we do have flexibility with time. So don't feel too constrained by the 20 minutes, but also we might have a little bit of time for more questions, more discussion at the end, or a little bit of a longer break before we have the final closing session. I'll introduce the speakers and the papers before they present, and I'll ask, as we've done throughout the symposium, that if you have questions, you save them to the end. You're also welcome to type questions and comments in the chat function as we go along as well. And if you have questions you'd like me to read out, you can pop them in there too. Our first paper then we will move on to. So we have Abel de Santos and Wigglesworth, who are presenting on the legacy of Santa Cruz for Timorese youth activism and development initiatives. Now, Abel, who is joining us from Portugal, has been a community development lecturer at the Faculty of Social Science at UNTIL since 2002. He's currently completing doctoral studies at Porto University, specialising in rural community development and peasant movements. He has also worked in various research projects, including with the Labour Mobility Assistance Program, Oxfam, Paz y Desarrollo, and the Asia Foundation. Abel is joined by Dr. Anne Wigglesworth, who has 30 years' experience in international development NGOs. She enrolled in a PhD at Victoria University, focusing on young generation Timorese, and her book, based on her thesis research, is titled Activism and Aid, Young Citizens' Experiences of Development and Democracy in Timor-Leste. Anne's also a long-term member of Friends of Suai Kobalima and an honorary fellow at Victoria University in Melbourne. And Anne consults, writes and teaches on civil society, gender and labour migration. So their paper, as I mentioned, The Legacy of Santa Cruz for Timorese Youth Activism and Development Initiatives. Over to you, Abel and Anne. You're both on mute at the moment, so I'll just ask you to unmute so we can hear you.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night to all of us. Thank you, Hannah, for the for the opportunity. So I will start this presentation, and then will be continued by Anne. The topics of our presentation is the legacy of Santa Cruz for Timorese activism and development initiative. Okay, this presentation reflects on the nature of student activism following the Santa Cruz Massacre and the processes that have contributed to the rise and subsequent decline of civil society activism after the independence of Timor-Leste. We also describe two different partnership models driven by the Geração Phone, or young generation activists, which aim to bring empowerment and equality back into the development partnership. Yeah.
Can you see that all right? Can you see the screen all right?
Yes, we can.
Because for me, it's covered up by the
you have to minimize your, how to say?
Yeah, but it's already minimized.
We can see it now.
Okay, it's a second slide, please. The other slide. Okay. The legacy of Santa Cruz Massacre for activism in Timor-Leste. As we know that after the Santa Cruz Massacre, the volunteer leadership gave new prominence to the student and youth movement's role in pursuit of Timorese independence. Many youth and student activists become actively involved in supporting the independence struggle through the clandestine front, and for the first time, they played a major role in the resistance struggle. Their involvement at the time was also inspired by the ideology of national liberation that had been initiated by Fretilin in 1975, where the success of the struggle rested on the strength of the people themselves and or based on collective strength. Social relations during the process of the struggle for independence were built on the basis of mutual trust and a common struggle for liberation in a network of clandestine relations in both urban and rural areas. Next slide, please, Anne. Okay. The involvement of Jera Sound Phone activists in the struggle were driven by concerns about human rights violence and the military repression during the Indonesian occupation. Clandestinely, they made people aware of the importance of Timor-Leste's independence and then organized and encouraged the active participation of all elements of society in supporting the struggle because they were inspired by the idealism of a national liberation struggle that relied on the use of people's power. They becomes a moral force in pushing for social change, a rule they carried into the independence era. This rule of young activists was very much supported by the community. After the 1999 crisis, young activists were faced with how to rebuild their country after devastation left by the Indonesians and liberate the independent country from poverty and illiteracy. Okay, now I invite Anne to continue the presentation. Please, Anne.
Thank you, Abel. Yeah, this statue, of course, as it was mentioned in the previous session, is of the 12th of November. And I wasn't aware of the level of controversy about it, but certainly I noticed that there's no description represented, and that young people who I talked to actually when I took this photo didn't really have very much understanding about the events that it was representing, which I thought was unfortunate. So I'm going to talk about the international response to the crisis in Timor and the way that impacted on activism in Timor. And as we know, in '99, there were hundreds of international agencies arriving in Dili for various emergency reconstruction activities. And their need for local organizations to work with to act as bridges to the communities meant that a lot of local organizations started to form, local NGOs started to form to fill that gap. Meanwhile, there was a lot of concern in Dili about the lack of consultation. The international agencies came in and sort of took over and didn't consult Timorese political leaders or activists and NGOs that were there. And a number of NGOs had started to form by that time. So donors brought money and humanitarian support, but they also brought very new perspectives and values. And so the basic principles that had inspired the Jera Sound Phone activists were constrained by the influence of outside interventions. The only role that was made available to them through that level of the international support was as service providers in a sort of patron-client relationship. And looking globally at the NorthSouth Partnership, in the 1970s and early 80s, most international NGOs, and this was I was working in NGOs at this time, very much about solidarity and support for local civil society and fulfilling local civil society's objectives and programs and so on. But this changed with the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s onwards. And nowadays, NGO relationships are very much based around the results-based management system, establishing accountability to donors. But it also has been found to distort and weaken local NGOs' accountability to their own citizens. And there's been some research done by some very well-known specialists in civil society who were looking at the changes over 20 years from 1996 to 2015 and found that the actual ability of international organizations to positively impact on local civil society has declined, even though the actual numbers of NGOs, international NGOs operating has increased. And the external pressures on international NGOs from their donors and their government support has drawn these organizations away from supporting at the grassroots level. So in this model, the local NGOs are pushed into prioritizing accountability to their donor over that of their implementation partners. So just have a quick look at the sort of process that in 1998, only 14, and that was the first year that NGOs were legally allowed to form. It was the year that Suharto fell, and very soon after that, they started to form local organizations. And then, of course, the arrival of the international agencies was very rapid. And by 2002, there was 250 international organizations in Timor, and 515 local NGOs had formed to meet their partnership needs largely. By 2004, there were many humanitarian agencies started to leave. They were going off to crises elsewhere in the world. And the numbers of NGOs started to decline. As you see, 2006, there were only 2/3 of what there had been several years earlier. And the international NGOs about a quarter. So 2006-07, of course, there was a political military crisis. And there was another upsurge of international organizations came in and funding for meeting the emergency that was taking place. And one of the striking things was that in the in the early emergency period, there was a lot of criticism of the international agencies by the Timorese civil society that, that they weren't collaborating with local organizations and they weren't supporting local organizations. And this criticism reoccurred in the 2006-08 period, where NGOs were quite angry. I was doing my PhD research at the time, and they were quite angry about how they weren't getting opportunities to operate their programs, even though they were very relevant. Some of them were related to trauma, some of them were related to community building and conflict resolution. But they could only get money to do what was in the international NGO programs. And I have to say that, again, in 2020, in the COVID-19 sort of crisis, again, very little money has been made available to local NGOs, and that was written about by Annie Sloman from Oxfam. So, it's sad to see this continuing factor. So now, in 2019, there were 200 local NGOs. There'd been a large number that were inactive on the books, and Fongtil, when I last met them in 2018, they had been very active deregistering inactive NGOs, and so this is now how many we have. So the North-South Partnership model undermined the liberation ideology that Abel talked about, which is based on community self-reliance and empowerment. So a large number of local NGOs formed to partner with international, and a lot of those formed as job creation for the youth. So partnerships were based on the donors' operational objectives rather than local NGOs. So they became agents of service delivery, short-term contracts, and accountability to donors. And the Je ne sais Fin activists, who were the ones who had been in that active in the 1990s, remained very critical of the INGO domination in aid and lack of consultation. So we're going to just look at some of the other ways of operating now. If we know effective community development based on encouraging the community to analyze their problems and empower them to solve their problems. And this opportunity isn't provided in this contractual model. And also that trust and mutual responsibility are very essential ingredients in effective partnership, as they were essential ingredients of the liberation struggle. And now I'm going to hand over to Abel, who will talk about the KSI and its support for social movements and how it facilitates communities. And then I'll go on to talk about the Friends of Zwei and Covalima partnership based on friendship and mutual responsibility. So over to you, Abel.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne. So KSI was founded in 2000 by Xerasound activists who were active during the independence struggle. One of KSI's important roles in community empowerment in Timor can be seen in their strong support for the peasants' movement in Ermera, which began in 2001 until now. Since the start, the programs initiated by KSI have been directed to support community initiatives. From this emerged a peasant social movement in Ermera, which formed the União Agricultores Ermera, or Ermera Farmers Union, UNAIR, in 2010 to demand agrarian reform. Next slide, please, Anne. Okay. The empowerment of the empowerment processes carried out by KSI, for example, in their approach to the community, they always start by first holding a discussion with community members using a participatory approach to identify community problems and available resources that can be used to address the problems faced by the community. During 2003 to 2005, KSI collaborated with the Sahe Institute for Liberation, or SIL, a national NGO, to organize an activist school known as Escola Baukun Rasikan, or School for Liberation, EURA. So the school was based on the idea that an independent East Timor needed to be built by first looking at the potential and strength of its people. Then in 2014, KSI established the Instituto Economia Fulidayday, SLULU, to educate, to train, and to prepare young farmer activists from villages in Ermera to be a community facilitator in their respective villages. The education and empowerment of farmers as well as community facilitators are based on promoting social justice, human rights, social equality, and reinforcing the mission and vision of the UNAIR social movement itself. Regarding the relationship between donors and the community, KSI does not give donors direct contact with communities in order to minimize the donor influence. In the relationship with the community, KSI positioned itself as a facilitator to facilitate the development process and provide a strong voice to the community. Therefore, KSI is not only active in organizing and empowering communities at the grassroots level, but is also active in national and international forums that are directly related to social movements and farmer issues. This is a strategy from KSI in nationalizing and also internationalizing local community issues to get global attention. Okay, and then I'll give the opportunity to Anne to continue presenting about the
thank you.
partnership. Please, Anne.
Thank you, Abel. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the friendship is a partnership model that's been established in between Australia and Timor-Leste, linking geographically communities in Australia with communities of a district or sub-district in Timor. And they were formed after the 1999 events of a way of creating friendship and saying that the kind of events that happened could never happen again without people being in touch and knowing what's going on and being able to provide support and advocacy. So there's 35 friendship groups, more or less, based on people-to-people relations of very varying in size and impact. You can't generalize. Each has their own method and approach. I've been a member of Friends of Swai Covalima since 2004, partnered with Covalima District, and supported by the city of Port Phillip for 20 years now. But the important point about its success is that the Jeux de Saint-Fond activists who are at the core of the work in the community centre in Covalima they were Student Solidarity Council activists and committed to contribute to development. They actually were sent up to Covalima to register people for the ballot in '99, and in their conversations with the community, and the community was sort of, they promised the community that they would return to Covalima and help the development of the district. So what the Friends of Swai did is offered a vehicle for them to be able to do what they had committed themselves as a group to do. There's only been one piece of research, significant piece of research on the friendships, and that's by a PhD was written by Fiona Nines on this. And she found that the most effective friendship groups were those based on mutuality, long-term commitment, partnerships with the same level of authority, responsibility, equality, and reciprocal obligations. So Alberto Barros is the director. He said, Friends of Swai has big differences from NGOs, which have their own vision and mission before they partner with any local NGO. They look for ways to implement work to meet their own vision and mission with Friends of SWI, the vision and mission is driven by our work in SWI and in consultation with the people. And then we join together to prepare a joint strategic plan. And he also said time-bound projects do not drive the friendship, that staff can find ways to resolve problems without penalties for deviation from pre-prepared and often externally imposed project designs. It's very clear. And they, Friends of SWI, do have a lot of programs with international NGOs, and they very much value their support. But and there's a range of work that's going on, and you see there's a range of different organizations that have been involved, but the friendship has provided an ongoing support to capacity building and like core funding support, and you know, and it has been referred to as walking together by Webster, which is who was the Timorese advisor to Friends of SWI for many years, Timorese academic here in Melbourne. So a lot has been achieved through this process, and nowadays the budget of the CCC with only a minor part of it would come from Friends of SWI. It's a whole range of programs, so it really is run by them and has been a registered NGO since 2010. So in conclusion, Timorese student activism since Santa Cruz has been built on the ideologies of building the strength of the people, and the idealism of the struggle years had to be kind of negotiated with new demands when the international development agencies came in. And sadly, many local NGOs have become part of a project service delivery role, accountable to donors rather than communities. But we believe that both these initiatives of CCC and KSI, which are driven by Jeunes Enfants ideology, make a very effective contribution to local development and a significant model of what can work to really support local communities. And the liberation struggle was effective because of the trust and the mutuality struggle. And now we believe civil society partnerships need to re-establish that trust and that mutuality between local NGOs and INGOs, but also between the communities and the local NGOs that work with them. So, thank you. If you have any questions.
Thank you very much to Anne and Abel. We will hold questions until after the second paper. So I would like to introduce our second presenters for this session. So we have a paper from John Waddingham, David Webster, and Jazmine Aldrich on new archival records on Santa Cruz from Solidarity Movement collections. So John Waddingham was a founding member of Melbourne's Australia East Timor Association in 1975 and editor of the Timor Information Service newsletter from 75 to 83. Since the early 2000s, John has managed CHART, an Australian project to locate, preserve and promote access to surviving archival records about Timor-Leste for the period 1974 to 1999. And John is also an occasional archives consultant to the Centro Nacional Chega in Dili. John is presenting with David today. So David Webster is a professor of history and global studies at Bishop's University and an adjunct research professor at Carleton University. His most recent book is Challenge the Strong Wind, Canada and East Timor 1975 to 99. And I think we've got a little link to the book in the new books section of the website, so do have a look there. David worked with the East Timor Alert Network of Canada starting in 1987, and he is also a member of the International Advisory Council of Centro Nacional Chega. So John and David will present a paper, and to reiterate, the title is New Archival Records on Santa Cruz from Solidarity Movement Collections. You should have access to share your screen, David or John, if you'd like to show us.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. If people cannot see the right-hand side of the screen, you're able to move the little window with pictures to the bottom or the top of the screen. And you can also pop out the chat or participants function to give you something else on the right. So if you need to full screen this in any way, it can be done. I want to acknowledge the contribution also of Jazmine Aldrich, who's has a full day of work today at an archive and therefore can't be here quite this early in the North American morning, but who's been doing a lot of work this year on getting materials up online for this project. So we're talking about new archival records on Santa Cruz from Solidarity Movement collections. And my colleague John will talk about some of the nuts and bolts and practical consideration. So I'm just going to briefly introduce this. Essentially, in creating the Timor International Solidarity Archive, which is located at timorarchive.com. I should have posted the link there. We're trying to preserve memory of the overseas support for the international struggle for human rights and self-determination in Timor-Leste as a form of activism. So that's the goal. Yeah, Hannah's just posted the link. Thank you, Hannah. Particularly recently this year, we've been, and particularly John and Jazmine have been working on creating a Santa Cruz special collection. This is the landing page. Rather than me talking about it, I'm going to let John talk about it because he's done a great deal more work on this than I have. So I'm just going to advance and John, please take over.
Thanks, David. Before I get into Tesa, I just want to briefly survey the whole issue of archives about Timor. And this is a very crude sort of impression of the sort of material that we'd find around the world. I constructed this on the airplane from Melbourne to Sydney this morning. So it is admittedly crude and done from the top of my head. But what I've tried to show here is this, just the beginnings of a very broad understanding of the amount of material that's potentially available internationally on Timor. And I've sort of identified three different groups of archives. One are solidarity groups and individuals, that is organisations that have emerged specifically to work on the East Timor issue in the 74 to 99 years. Sorry, I'm not quite up to that, David. So, and then non-government organisations I distinguish a bit from solidarity groups in that they're generally pre-existing organisations that have taken on the Timor issue in one way or another. Think of Amnesty International or my mind's gone blank at the moment, International Red Cross, a whole lot of organisations that took on the Timor thing in different ways, which throw light on the Timor story. And of course, there are governments. Now, this is just a very simple snapshot. If we go on to the next slide, it just gives a bit of a picture of what I know about in Australia. There's a broad range of materials in Australia. Some of them marked in red are already in public archives in Australia. Others are still held privately. Some of them you might even be able to see some archives boxes behind my back. I'm actually living in a room which is full of archive boxes, and I'll sleep on the floor with them tonight here in Sydney. It's my lot to deal with these things. But anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of material, and the question is, can I have the next slide? Thank you. We know we've got a good idea of what's around internationally. We've got a good idea of what's going on in Timor, archives-wise. But we're much less clear about Indonesia, and this is just an aside, really. It's in my mind the big unknown, and something that will really need to get the attention of sympathetic Indonesians or people with contacts in Indonesia who can speak the language and get an understanding of the importance of this part of Indonesia's history. But we'll come back to that later on in discussion if needs be. But okay, if we could go on to the next slide. So Tesa, as developed by David, is sort of the realisation of a dream for me, actually. I've been mucking around with Timor archives for the last 20 years, and it's been always my desire to see a place where one can at least get an idea of what exists and where you can find it and what's in it, and if you're lucky, be able to actually see digital copies of the material online. Now, Tesa ticks a very big box for me in that it relies on archival description software. And for me as an archivist, that's really important, because archival description software does the one thing that most other digital library type programs doesn't do, and that's record context. It actually records the relationships that exist between documents. So if you go to the Casa Comum database for the Resistance Archive, or you go to Timor Online to see the CDPM and APPTL documents, you'll see that there you can see a lot of very interesting and very valuable documents, but you can't see anything about the nature of their origins and their relationships to other documents. So this is the one big thing that Tesa does, and I think it's got a huge potential to be the place where all of us with interest in Timor research might be able to go. It's still early days for Tesa. There are a few collections on it which are quite described in detail, and there are some which are going to be described in detail in coming months. The most well represented at the moment are David's Canadian ETAN and the US ETAN. And then some of the newsletters. We've started to develop a newsletters area, which has got a lot of the solidarity newsletters. And I think that's going to be a terrific and increasingly valuable resource. But I thought that the Santa Cruz moment for this symposium was the moment to illustrate what Tesa can do. And so I want to move on to the next slide and talk about how we tried to provide access to Santa Cruz material. One way was to look at what is already on the Tesa database and apply a subject heading to any record there that has substantial content about Santa Cruz. So, you know, when you use a library catalogue, you have subject headings to find related books. Well, we've invented a subject heading on Tesa called the Santa Cruz Massacre. It's the only subject heading in Tesa at the moment, and that's a whole other story. But so we've, Jazmine in particular has gone through all of the material on Tesa to identify anything with significant Santa Cruz material. And so currently there are 180 or so descriptions of documents and newsletters with significant Santa Cruz content. So I can go to the next slide. But there is some very interesting and very valuable Santa Cruz material which is not in Tesa. It's in other databases. And I thought it was important that we find a way of linking to that material as well. And so I think in this dreadful period of deaths of famous people, we're of course mourning the loss of the famous Kamaburiajo, and her Tapol archives are a very rich resource in all sorts of ways, not least on Santa Cruz. Now, the Tapol archives went to Lisbon. I'm not sure what's happened to them since then, but they've been digitised and are accessible through the Resistance Museum database run by Casa Comum in Portugal. So it's one of a number of online archives that we've pointed to. It was technically a bit tricky, and I don't know whether it's a long-term solution, but it's an example of the way in which we can point to other material which is not in the Tesa database. The other significant records in this special collection of material is the CDPM and APPTL collections, which I referred to earlier. We can go to the next slide. My last contribution here is to just talk about one of the collections that now is on Tesa related to the Santa Cruz massacre. It's the files on the topic from the Australian Council for Overseas Aid Human Rights Office. Now, almost everyone here will have heard of Pat Walsh and the ACPO Human Rights Office. Pat's an interesting character, a unique character really in Timor solidarity work, in that he had one foot in the activist sort of camp and one foot in the more formal NGO camp, and was able to bring value to each of them from the other. Now, he started working for ACFOA in 1979, or at least started to be in the ACFOA framework around then. So by 1991, he had a very well-developed contact list, a very well-developed program, and had a very, very good reputation. There were people who disagreed with him, of course, but that's standard. But he had very good links through the NGO community in particular, and was trusted by them for the most part. So he was able to quickly, I'm not saying it's just him, there are other people working with him, but he's sort of the driving force of the thing, and it is a driving force. They were quickly able to gather information from lots of different places, collate it, circulate it widely. This is in the days when email was just kicking off. And so I think David may say something about ETAN US and its role in this regard. But the thing I want to say about this collection is it contains a lot of material about what happened at Santa Cruz, eyewitness accounts and other things like that. But it also tells you what Australian activists did on the issue of Timor, and behind that shows you the processes that were used to get to those products of lobbying and formal letters and all sorts of things. So it's not just the final products of activism, but it shows you the logistics and the work that goes on behind the scenes to do that work. And I think as such is a highly valuable insight into this form of activism, and in this particular case on how it was responded to in Australia anyway, how the Santa Cruz thing was responded to. I'm going to hand over to David, who will continue the exposition of Santa Cruz Massacre archives. Thanks, David.
Thank you, John. I wish that every activist collection was as well organized as those neat files that are in that image. Sadly, this is not the case. So,
no, well, sorry, can I just say, I should have mentioned, this is actually photos of the original files. Not, there's a huge amount in this office which is not in that state, but this was one particular focus which they had people working on to make sure the filing system worked. Yeah.
If you look at some of the photos from the early collections we have, you'll see documents that have been thrown away because they had active mold cultures growing on the papers. So we photographed them and for human safety reasons had to pulp the actual original papers after digitization. So the state of records is an interesting aspect as well. But I'm supposed to talk about two more case studies alongside the Australian Council for Overseas Aid, Human Rights Office, and the work of Pat Walsh. The United States. Another figure here is Arnold Cohen. Clinton Fernandez yesterday spoke about congressional action on the role of Cohen and other what he called unsung heroes behind the scenes. We do have on this online archive now the bulk of the papers, not the handwritten personal diaries, but the bulk of public-facing records and correspondence and so on from Arnold Cohen, which tells a story about how that work in the US Congress began. And it tells us a whole bunch of things. So Clinton again yesterday spoke about a structure of legitimacy. And you can see that structure of legitimacy, for instance, in the way that senators exchange letters to each other. I love this letterhead because it's so American West. Senator Malcolm Wallop is a very conservative Catholic in the Republican Party who turned out to be a very important figure in generating in 1991, first an open letter from 52 senators, and then a joint congressional resolution after the Santa Cruz Massacre, building on previous work. What's important to draw from this, perhaps, is the importance of Catholic networks, yes, but also the importance of legitimacy in reaching out to conservatives. There were a lot of conservative supporters for this activism, a lot of religious supporters, a lot of members of the right wing, and sometimes that drew on, and this is much less celebratory than many studies of solidarity movements would be, sometimes it drew on anti-Islamic and anti-Asian racism even, drawing on the character of East Timor as a small Christian country fighting against a large Muslim invader, a caricature certainly, but one that was able to be drawn on for this type of behind the scenes lobbying work. There is a whole series of letters, for instance, from bishops and Catholic organizations trying to get the signature of a key senator in foreign affairs, Senator Joe Biden, a name you may have heard, since he's now the president. They did succeed in getting his support, but it came from other sources originally. Okay, you can see things in these 1991 and 1992 Cohen files about, for instance, the way that the documentary filmed by Max Stahl in cold blood and the footage of the massacre itself was planned, how the script was consulted upon by Arnold Cohen, how Peter Gordon of Yorkshire Television had extensive contacts in advance. So the spontaneity is not necessarily the story here. So much of the Santa Cruz film and documentation that made East Timor into a much larger international issue after 1991 comes from this sort of behind the scenes planning. We only know that because the archival records are now available, because Arnold Cohen has agreed to share those records. Peter Gordon is also willing to share some records, perhaps in the future. So there's a lot of stories there. The battle for information after Santa Cruz is a going concern. it's an ongoing struggle for who's going to tell the story of what happened at Santa Cruz. We know the Indonesian government's efforts. We know from, for instance, Peter Job's paper yesterday about the struggle and the Australian government initial estimates of the death toll and how that was going to be handled. Was this rogue elements killing people, or was this part of a systemic campaign of terror against the Timorese people? Largely, the battle for information was won in the United States by those who supported the cause of Timorese self-determination and human rights. So I put up on this slide the first protest organized from White Plains, New York, by Charlie Shiner. This is a December 1991 demonstration that will eventually lead to the creation of the East Timor Action Network in the United States, a post-Santa Cruz street protest approach that went alongside this behind-the-scenes organizing and lobbying-based approach, and led to a new phase in the solidarity movement. I have here a letter from Jose Ramos Horta in 1991 after the massacre to solidarity groups saying, here are the strategies we should follow. And by and large, you can see those strategies happening in many solidarity group actions. You can see it hammered out at a solidarity groups meeting in Geneva in 1992. You can see this sort of new approach forming. And the way that, I'm going to go back one here, the way that we saw the creation of this series of documents produced on the PeaceNet and other progressive listservs created through the Association for Progressive Communications, an early online consortium for dissemination of progressive causes online. The Reg East Timor list is distributed on PeaceNet. This is, these documents compiled by Charlie Shiner of ETAN US are a remarkable testimony and a remarkable document. So I underline here also the importance of documents that already exist in telling this story. Very few people look at this, but it's got everything from this crucial period that was posted online by activists. So it tells an enormously important story. These are also online materials available to all. So too, for instance, are thousands of hours of footage from Maxtal that are available through a mirror site at the University of Coimbra. So this is all available to you. The metadata, the descriptions of the documents are in French, but Google Translate for all its imperfections is available to you. Why these are in French is a long story, which we can come back to perhaps later on. Third case study, Clamor por Timor in Brazil. Here's an organization founded in the aftermath of Santa Cruz. ETAN US is founded in the aftermath of Santa Cruz. Many other organizations are. Many groups see a flowering and a growth of support after this period. Clamor por Timor is one of these groups, founded in Sao Paulo in 1992, based on Catholic liberation theology and inspired by the model of a group organizing in the 1980s and 90s against the military regimes that then dominated South America, named Clamor. This group, Clamor por Timor, is involved in Portuguese networks centered on Lisbon and solidarity movements there, also hooked into the International Federation for East Timor movements, and takes similar tactics to some of the groups in the global north, but perhaps with a stronger focus on Portuguese Lusophone culture. I raise this because there's a structural issue here in this project, which is that it's much easier to access government archives, and when it comes to solidarity movement archives, it's much easier to access materials in Australia, the United States, Canada, Britain, Portugal, and other countries. What we're trying to do here is a form of aspirational archiving, which is working really hard to get materials from the global south in order to tell a more complete story. So to get the Clamor por Timor papers, such as we have them on the Timor International Solidarity Archive now, we're talking about a Brazilian member of the research team contacting archives in Brazil, trying to track down where these papers might be, finally locating them, traveling to them, being denied access because they were not yet cataloged, my university finding the funds to pay for them to be digitized on site by that archive, by somebody in there working in their spare time, and then describing the materials in English, which is perhaps more accessible to a wider audience. But some of these documents are also in, for instance, Norwegian. So I've got someone working on translating Swedish and Norwegian materials right now. So there's a real access issue to getting these less accessible archives that needs to be thought about as part of this project, right? How are we going to get these stories from the Global South? So I'm sorry I'm going on so long, but I'll finish up right now. So implications from this whole project. To me, and this is really the philosophy behind this whole project, is that preserving memory is a form of activism. Preserving these source materials allows us to see fragments of history. It links to things like the efforts right now to tell the history of Timorese women, to tell the history, and just spoke about the friendship groups, particularly the Suai Kovalima story. You're not going to see that in dominant archives, right? But you're going to see it by the papers preserved by activists. And I think we had a great description of that group and that whole project and its philosophical approach in the previous paper. So it's an effort to move in the slogan of the Centro Nacional Chega, through memory to hope. So I think there's a desperate need to discover archives, to describe them, to digitize them, to disseminate them. They allow us to tell stories that aren't always visible in government archives. By putting them up online, we make them accessible, free, in a more flat playing field to a number of different people, including those without access to universities in the developed world or the overdeveloped world, where so many research materials on Timor-Leste are only available for, you buy a book for over $100, not accessible to most people in the real world, right? Putting these materials also online, I think, gives what John was talking about, the context for the document. This is the metadata, we call it in archivist speak, right? But where does this document fit? How does it relate to other things? Who wrote it? Why did they write it? When did they write it? Who read it? Who listened to it, or who screened the video? These are all important things in order to understand the full story. And this is how historians, of course, do research. But I do need to underline also some problems here. There are structural barriers that favor better resourced collections based in wealthier countries, and we need to be aware of that and try to overcome those structural barriers. And we need transparency. There's a lot of people holding private collections that really it would be wonderful and helpful to researchers to see shared. So I put up a little quotation about transparency and secrecy in a completely different context from Lisa Palmer's recent book, Island Encounters, just a screenshot from the phone there. But anything we found, we were told to keep secret. That's the legacy of how people organized under clandestine methods and noms de guerre, such as Max Stahl, for many years. I think we're at the time where we need to open up these records and be able to tell a fuller story and not just nationalist narratives. And I hope that the project we've talked about here is a way of allowing that to happen. So Hannah, sorry to go on too long there, but you said you wouldn't be too tough on time. So we took a little more. So apologies for that. But thanks for listening.
No problem at all. Thank you very much. I'm clapping so you can hear. Everyone else is too. Thanks, John and David, for that presentation. We have about, well, just under half an hour time for questions and discussion. Would you like to raise your hand if you have a question or type something into the chat? We'll go one by one, question and then answer, so that we have space for discussion as well. So let's start with Vanessa. You have your hand up there.
Thank you very much, David and John, for your paper. I'm sorry I missed Anne's earlier. I just had a question, David. You mentioned about the difference of access to materials from the Global South, and I wondered whether you've looked into Indonesian activist materials. I mean, some of those are available through the Australian collections, for example. They've been collected by solidarity groups in Australia. But I started collecting them a few years ago when I started this project on Indonesian perceptions about the East Timor annexation. Materials by all the different solidarity groups, people's letters and various things like that, which I just wonder, and they're also stored in the International Institute of Social History in the Netherlands as well. So there's just sort of, loose bits and pieces everywhere, whether, some of the key protagonists of the Indonesian activists are still around, that we could actually gain permission from them to also upload many of these materials, but maybe they're already somewhere, they're scattered all over the place. So what sort of access have you been able to have to those materials? And secondly, I just wanted, based on your presentation, I just wondered whether this is something I've informally canvassed with the committee members for this symposium, is that perhaps with the growth of TLSA, that we actually start to think about forming some loose interest groups around particular fields of research. So in this particular one, I'm thinking of, could be around history and archival studies, for example, so for us to be able to share, what sources there are for our research, but also to try and support this area a lot more in terms of also supporting East Timorese researchers to gain access to historical materials. Thank you. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, I'm simply going to say yes to that second point. That would be definitely the way to go. There need to be some conversations about how to get these materials. So we don't have to necessarily host everything on the same website. This is not an effort at control of information, right? This is an effort, however flawed, at making information more freely available. But we can also simply link to existing collections where they're digitized. In other cases, we would like to digitize as much as possible. There are various grant applications in, and I will be sending out emails saying more collaborators for project very much needed. We have some grant applications going in that I hope will be helpful on this. Are those materials available yet? No. Is there a whole question about oral histories? Absolutely there is. And I think Hannah can speak to the importance of oral histories better than I can. But we want to find a way to make this all possible. There are privacy and copyright concerns that always have to be addressed. There's one grant application in right now that will help to address how do we deal with the issues of privacy and copyright in a sensitive and legal fashion across multiple jurisdictions and dealing with people with different comfort levels. So we're really at an early stage here. We did like a soft launch of this site, but it's got a long way to go. So it's an early stage. We thought we'd just start doing it to say, here's what this platform can do. For me, it's a pretty successful platform because it's good for historians. But I'd really like to bring in and allow more people to be involved, and it's easy to create a contributor account for those who are interested in doing that. We can absolutely start to do more of that. It's just that it's difficult to go to the Institute for Social History, particularly during COVID and with restrictions. But maybe there's some people closer to the files themselves that can go to them, right? So, so that's a slightly incoherent answer, but my attempt at an answer. Right? I'm going to just say one more thing, which is there can be a sense among academics that we need to guard our data in order to protect our publication possibilities. And that's valid, particularly for early career researchers. So we can perhaps do things like things can be made available but embargoed until after the publication of a certain academic. But, we do need to think about our responsibilities as researchers to those being studied. My favorite quote from a Papuan is, don't use your data as a pillow. Sort of how we handle our research raw materials is a big, big debate among academics, right? That still needs to be had. So maybe this interest group would be a good way to have this discussion, right?
John, did you want to add anything to David's comment?
I could add a lot, but I'll just say to that last point, as a non-academic, that it has the same issue has concerned me for a very long time, that researchers sort of are rightly delighted to find new sources, which allows them to expand the story. But I think even from first principles, others need to see that primary source material. They need also to be able to interrogate it and see if they agree with the interpretation of that material and not just accept the researchers' arguments about its content. So look, I'm a big fan. I remember speaking to one academic. I said, I understand you will want to sit on this stuff for a while. He said, no, I'm very happy for everyone to have it. I can still do what I want to do with it. Anyway, look, I'm not an academic, but I do think that I would just affirm David's idea that once the new material that you've got access to has served its purpose in your research work, then I think I would certainly like to see it as a fundamental principle that it gets shared then with others to be able to draw on.
And I think too, from the perspective of when I was a PhD student, one of the first things that kind of struck me about Timor scholars was this willingness to share materials and to, introduce you to people. When I spoke to my fellow PhD students about it, they couldn't believe how sort of generous many of the senior scholars were in this field. TLSA equals sharing. We've got some lovely comments as well on the side there from people who've used some of these resources, David and John. So just to alert your attention to that. Helen, you have a question.
Yes, I would like to ask a question to Abel and Anne about the Génération Fond and their influence on sort of development discourse in a way, I think, because, I do agree with the general point that they've made about student activists, basically, one's based in Dili more than one's based in Indonesia, who became influential in the movement for self-determination and then became involved in development issues. But I'm just really wondering where it's led. Look, I'll just give you an example. Ego Lemos was, of course, involved in the foundation of permaculture, was one of these activists. Another one of these activists was Mariano Sabino. He was actually in Indonesia, but he was an activist in the various movements. Now, they came out with two totally opposed views on agriculture. And I just wonder whether the Génération Fond has got any possibility to sort of revive itself in a way and have a genuine debate about issues like agriculture, education and information science, the sort of thing you've been talking about. There is no librarianship taught in Timor. There is no hardly any IT. There is not any archivism taught. And there's a whole lot of needs of the country which are going by the board and not being addressed by the current leadership. And just getting back to Abel's point on KSI, I'd be very interested to know whether they are connected still with Via Campesina, the international peasant movement, which actually changed the views of the FAO on agriculture, and promoted agroecology and sustainable agriculture, because agriculture globally is an area of huge contention, and Timor has the second worst malnutrition in the world, and it needs to really get its head around this debate. So maybe if Abel and Anne could comment on some of the things I've raised.
Thanks for your
and
question,
anyone else.
Abel, would you like to maybe start us off here? We can't hear you. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Helen, for the question. Okay, I would like to the second question. Yeah, of course, the KSI still have a link with La Via Campesina. So the important things of the participation or the involvement of KSI, and also not only KSI but through KSI, UNAIR also as part of the they KSI bring also UNAIR. That's why in my presentation I was mentioned about how KSI how to say play an important role in terms of nationalizing and internationalizing global issues, how to bring the local issues, how to say advocated the local issues, bring to the national and international forums to discuss or to have a strong support from not to globalize the local issues. So this is the strategy. That's why that's why the rule of KSI in the participation of KSI and in La Via Campesina and the other La Via Campesina and the other international forums, it's more important for the how to say to promote or to advocate the peasants movement in Timor-Leste. That was.
Are they having any influence on the government? Are they having any influence on the
government?
Yes,
they yeah. Do you know? It was in 2012. Ramos Horta was voted the land laws because of the influence of the civil society organization and civil society networks that at the time they were play an important role to influence national parliament to influence the president to when Ramos Horta will promulgate the land law.
That's right. They stopped
and also
promulgating.
And also in 2017 or 18, they had a discussion with the president, the actual president, Luolo, to discuss about the land law, the two land laws that after then the president promulgate based on the discussion or the how to say the information that they provide to the president at the time. So okay, and the other thing, sorry.
I'm just thinking about the Ministry of Agriculture, which is still promoting industrial agriculture. That's really what I'm just thinking.
Yeah, and now do you know now from 2000 and from the 2000 from 2010 to 2014, the UNAIR or peasants movement in Ermera was concentrated on how to advocate or to reinforce the movement by created the link with the civil societies organizations. But from 2015 until now, they also promote the sustainable agriculture. They called Kudaray Integrado. Yeah, this is a good thing because they try to diversify the plantation that they have reclaimed. Okay, so they try to diversify and how to have income from this. And the other thing about the first question, do you know, I maybe I'm wrong, but I think that when we got independence, we entered to the we entered to the new situation that invite all of young activists to to respond. Some of them they still they try to facilitate the community based on the spirit or the idealism that they had before. But some of them they enter to the structure. So I don't know, but if we know that at the time we have the construction of new Timorese elite, at the time that some of them, when they enter to the structure, they have no, I don't know, but maybe I'm wrong, but I think many of them, when they enter to the structure, they have no capacity or capability or strong influence to influence the structure. So I don't know that and also because of the outsider influence or global influence on the at the time, also give them to. But for example, Ego still continue. Ego and the other friends, such as I think Ante Bendito, and also the other friends, also they Ego and Bendito, they still try to promote the community empowerment based on the spirit of the idealism that they have. But some of them the other friends that they went to they are in the structures, I think their influence, they have a different approaches or different that I think this is the condition now. Okay, thank you. I think
this inevitably happens, I think. Yes, good. Thanks very much.
Okay. Anne, do you want to add more something?
I don't know whether Anne wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's a very it's a very sort of big ask that the Jeux des Enfants would be able to, have that level of influence on national policy. I do think, that they have, particularly Ego, he's influenced both the education department, and he had, I remember him talking about how the agricultural department, they used to, when they had trainings, they would give them all sort of rice and chicken or something, and he got them to change it to being, local vegetables were provided for lunch, and so it's a sort of incremental process of change, and I do think that a lot of the NGOs that were formed early on in the independence by the Jeux des Enfants they have been quite influential because they've been quite idealistic and principled and about how they worked. And, obviously a lot of the NGOs that formed at a later stage didn't have that kind of activist sort of knowledge and background and ideology that, just more easily just became sort of service providers within the network and didn't really sort of analyze their particular role with the community so much. And I think that's the strength, is that they do have that. But I don't think you can expect them to be, principal drivers of national policy in the ministries, because that's got a whole different dynamic going on. I must say, I wish that the NGO forum was, maybe more influential in being able to have an influence there, but probably
no, I guess the point I was trying to make is that a lot of the Jeux des Enfants are now the decision makers in the ministries.
That also changes.
Abel pointed out, they're in the structures, but they change their views.
Well, that's what happens. The same happens here. If activists go into government, they either bow down under the structure or you get out. There's not much else you can do. I mean, yeah.
Michael, you have your hand up. Do you have a question? We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Hang on. What have I done? Yes, I do have a question. Sorry, it's late here and I'm just eating something to get more brain power to keep up. Question for David and John.
Mm-hmm.
And one that comes up a lot in chart, as John and Hannah and everyone knows, and wanting to ask you, David and John, priorities, what to digitise. Obviously, that's the biggest, well, maybe it's not the biggest question, but it's a big question. And what sort of criteria or priorities are you adopting when obviously faced with so many choices of what to digitise? And you saw the collection, we saw the collection map that John did today. What are your guiding principles?
John, would you like to take this one first? Tricky.
It's a difficult one. I'll just lift my screen a bit. I don't know whether you can see this, but I'm surrounded by about 200 archive boxes, and the owners of them want it all digitised, and it would take me till I was about 100 to do it. So it's not going to happen. We have done a fair bit of digitisation in chart, and really we've done as much as we can do with what we regard as important collections that we want Timorese and everyone else to be able to access, and we feel that digitisation is the way to go. The physical archives in each of the three cases I'm thinking of, but not the one behind me, will probably not go to Timor. The physical archive will stay in Australia. So, I mean, it is accessible if you visit Australia, but it's not otherwise. And so we've basically applied digitisation to collections that we think have particularly high value. But that's a very subjective thing. And if I had I'll give you an idea. Say the collection behind me, the thing that we've focused on has been, for example, some hitherto unheard Radio Mulberry broadcasts from the 1970s, a very big collection of photographs of solidarity actions in Australia, but also resistance photos from Timor in the 90s particularly. And what's the other thing? Any documents that came originally from the resistance inside Timor. And there are quite a few original materials from Connie Santana and Shanana and all of those guys in some of the boxes behind me. So we've prioritised those because we think that they will be of particular value and interest to Timor. But again, to everyone else as well. But that's been the way in which we've made decisions about this particular collection. But I don't have, off the top of my head, an immediate view about how you should prioritise. And I think there have been a few people now picking up on Vanessa's suggestion. And Zelia will recall that at our last conference, we talked about us archivists and historian people getting together and talking about these issues. Nothing happened, and I'm quite keen that we use this opportunity to pick up on that idea again. And I don't quite know how to do that, but these are the very sorts of issues that could be discussed by such a group of people. And I would say things like Tesa itself. David's the owner of it, but I think it would be good to get the views of people who want to make use of it and to hear about priorities that they might have for the sorts of material that might be there. But David, that's enough from me.
Did you want to comment briefly, David, as well?
Okay, so briefly, my own principles are start close to home. So I did Canada, and we spent some time working on Arnold Cohen because it was seen as significant. And I hope that ETAN US can be can be in the near future. COVID travel restrictions impose barriers also, right? And finances impose barriers because it's expensive to travel. That said, two basic points here is that as we get an archives and history working group established, I think we should have a special conversation on that and what is out there and how to prioritize it intelligently. Again, this is a tool rather than a specific research design.
Sure.
And I'd like to open up the tools to more people now that it's up and running, essentially. But second point is I'd like to see newsletters as a priority in the early years because it's relatively easy to get. So we've just got a set of New Zealand newsletters, for instance. I received the pretty much the full run for the Swedish East Timor Committee. Not many researchers are going to be able to read Swedish, so I have somebody translating the titles at least into English, so we'll have that more widely available. What happened in Sweden? There's an interesting story to be told, probably, but I don't know what it is because I don't speak Swedish. So getting the newsletters out there and comparing the newsletters across time and across space will be a really interesting project. And that's a more manageable project for many people and more accessible. Many people will have a run of their own newsletter available, and we'll just have to ask people to self-digitize it first. We can make it more involved over time. But there's a huge resource issue as well, which is Arnold Cohen's papers took 2 years to describe. It's a big project, right? And so it's not just digitizing, it's actually adding the metadata, which is the most time-consuming piece of this. And everybody has their own preferences on priorities. I wouldn't wish to state a priority beyond saying newsletters would be perfect. And yes, exactly. As Zelia's just posted, more conversations to come on this in the context of self-determination and solidarity. So take a look at that exciting upcoming event.
Thank you. So this is in the chat here. I'm going to have to bring this session to a close, but thank you very much to Anne, to Abel, to David, and to John for their presentations. And we can continue the discussion on the discussion forum as well. Thanks for sharing some resources and links here. I will have to wind this up though, but as I was saying before, I was thinking about, what unites the papers we've got here, because halfway through it, I thought, what are these having, in common? But David sort of brought up this question of the pandemic right at the end there. And so I wondered, what impact the pandemic had upon, solidarity in activism in terms of the capacity to collect, to archive materials, to travel, to access different materials, as well as on NGO activism. And Anne, you were talking about, friendship organisations, and it reminded me of the one near to my hometown. There's a Friends of Lolotoi in Castlemaine, and I remember my auntie was saying that people had knitted scarves to send to Timor, and she was like, what are they going to do with scarves? So she sewed them together to make blankets, because apparently, blankets for hospitals was something that sort of was needed as well. So I'll wrap it up now. Thank you very much to the speakers and to the questions. We will have one final closing session. The session will take place in the auditorium. So we will start at about 5 past. So you have a moment to sort of stand up, stretch, get a drink, go to the bathroom. And then I hope you can all join us in the auditorium for the closing session at about 5 minutes past. Thank you very much.